Okay, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to continue building out our volunteer application. And where we've gotten to so far is we've created the ability to have the secure login, where we can click on our login button and it'll take us to our list of volunteers, and we can edit the volunteers or we can create new volunteers. But likely in a system like this, we would also want to have the ability to log hours for our volunteers. So we want to know, in this maybe volunteer ID number 1 here, Fred Flintstone. Maybe we want to record that he worked 8 hours in February, and then he worked another 8 hours on another day, that type of stuff. So that over time, we can start to build reports. So reports you might consider would be, what are the total amount of volunteer hours per month for everybody, or maybe we want to see, who's the volunteer that's put in the most hours, that type of stuff. So we can keep track of things and maybe make some business decisions based on it. So what we want to do is we're going to add in another button here that allow us to log some hours. And before we can hook all this up, we're going to have to make some changes. We're going to have to add some tables, or at least a table in our database to store those hours. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the database, and then we'll work our way back through all the necessary steps to add this functionality. So let's go into Workbench. Okay, so use the volunteer database, and if we show all the tables currently in this database, you can see, oh, I did have one called hours work. Let me just predefine that, so let's drop that. Now let's think about what we want in that table. So we're going to create table hours worked. And I'm going to give a primary key here. So I'm going to call it the work ID. And that'll be an int. We'll make it not null. We'll make it auto increment. And we'll make that our primary key. So every time we add another record to this database, we'll have a unique way of identifying the record. Then we're going to also need to access the volunteer number. So if we look at our volunteers table, in the volunteers table, what uniquely identifies each volunteer is their volunteer ID. And we can see that a couple different ways. I guess intuitively from here, but explicitly if we look at, if we describe our table, here we can see that the primary key is the volunteer ID. And that's an important thing to have, because what we want to be able to do is I want to be able to say volunteer ID number 1 worked 8 hours on a specific day, or 4 hours on a specific day. I don't want to have to duplicate all this information for the volunteer, right? I don't want to have to store his first name, last name, phone number, birthday, all that stuff in multiple tables. So by just recording the number 1, that should be enough because it uniquely identifies this table. So what I'll do here is I'll say, we'll call it volunteer ID int. We'll make sure it's not null as well. Then we can say hours worked, integer. And then we'll also record the date. So we'll say date worked. Oops, forgot to add in my reference key. So right now, if we look at our table, although I have this volunteer ID, I could put in a number that is not part of my volunteer table. So for example, look at my volunteer table, the numbers go basically up to 12. Right now, if I wanted to, I could say insert into hours worked. It's really not a volunteer, a proper volunteer number. And we could say, 6 hours on 2nd of February. If I do this, it actually allows me to enter that into the database. And that's because there's no referential check between the tables. So now, if I tried to do a join between these two tables, it wouldn't work because look at this table, this volunteer ID, it's not valid. So the proper way to handle this is actually here when we're setting up this table, we can also set up something called a foreign key. And I'll say volunteer ID references the volunteers table. There we go. The other thing is we should make a couple of these things not null as well. So I want to at least put some values into every field if I'm going to put in a record. So what I do is rather than alter the table, I'm just going to say drop table hours worked. And then we'll create a new table. Now what's great is if I try this exact same piece of code that worked before, I try to do it now, it says it cannot add or update a child row. A foreign key constraint fails, meaning I'm referring to to a volunteer ID that's not valid. So our table is now set up in a way that we can use it. So now our backend's okay, and we're going to need to add some functionality to our volunteer so they can record hours worked. So let's go into Java and make that happen. So in our models, we have a volunteer. Let's zoom in for you. Okay. So what we're going to do is, let's go down here to the bottom. We'll add in a new method. So we're going to pass in a date, and we're going to pass in hours worked. We need to validate these things. So for example, the date shouldn't be any date. It should be something, maybe it's within the current year or previously in the current year. We can't record things in the future. And the hours, we might put some limits on that too. So for example, we can't have negative hours worked, nor can we have 1,000 hours worked in a day type of thing, right? We're gonna maybe restrict them to be a maximum of 24 hours. Let's just add in. See, let's say maybe less than 18 hours. Can't record more than 18 hours in a day. We want to force people to get some sleep. Okay, so validate the date. So we can say if see here is after. Okay, so it's in the future. We can take away minus years 1. Okay, so that will validate our the date passed in, and then we need a little validation for the hours worked. So we'll say if hours worked is greater than or equal to 0, and hours worked less than or equal to 18. Let's do the opposite of this. It's less than 0, or it's greater than 18. Okay, so if we've made it to this point in our code, we've now validated the date, validate the hours worked. Now we're ready to store in the database. Okay, and the steps for that, we're going to connect to the database. 2, we're going to create a prepared statement. 2, we'll prepare the query. And we'll convert the date. Then we're going to bind parameters. Eventually, we're going to execute Okay, so there's our basic steps for storing things in the database. So first things first, let's create a few things that we'll use in our database. We'll use a connection. And we'll use a prepared statement. This all inside the try here. Okay, so our connection equals driver manager connection. And we're going to use JDBC SQL. Mine's on my local host, which runs on port 3306. And the database name is volunteer. And username is student. And my password name is student. Oops. Put that here. Okay. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our prepared statement in a string here. So go back here. So we called it volunteer ID, hours worked, and date worked. Let me say values, and then we're going to put 3 question marks because remember, this is a prepared statement. We want to guard against SQL injection. So we have to put these question marks in, and then later down here, when we bind the parameters, that's when they'll put the actual values into these spots after they've been sanitized. And our prepared statement, use our connection, prepare the statement. And before we can store the date, everything here is in, we're inside of our app, we're handling everything as a local date object. So we need to convert that into a date object. So I'm going to say date, I'll just call it date worked. I called it date worked up here as well. So let's call this, let's just call this DW for date worked. Here's the magic. We take our prepared statement, and we're going to, first item is the volunteer ID. Second item is the date worked. Is the hours worked. then we can run our update. Yes. Okay. Then the last thing we need to do is we've got to make sure that we've properly closed down our connection. So we're going to use a finally block. Finally, here we'll say does not equal null, connection.close. And if preferred statement does not equal null, then close. Okay, so if we have an issue inside this try block, it would be caught here. And no matter what, we'll still close off the connection and the prepared statement. So at this point, we now have the ability to record hours into the database for a given worker. The next thing we have to do now is create a way for our users to actually record those hours and call this method. So to do that, we're going to have to create a new view. So go down to our views, and let's call it log hours. Use a Java controller. And we'll use the cascading style sheet that we've been using for the rest of our app, putting all of our style in one file. Let's open up our log hours view. Now we're going to do this in kind of two steps. The first is we're going to make an ability to log the hours so we can sort of test things. Let's do 800 by 600 for size. And bring this down. Let's throw in a vertical box, right click, hit the parent. And then we can add in a label. And to keep our styling consistent, this will be our header. And for now, we'll center everything. And let's use a small grid pane. And we'll add in some labels. Make sure we have the right person. We'll add in the volunteer ID, first name, last name, and I'm going to right click and I can add some rows below. Let's put in here a date worked. And we'll drag another label in to be hours worked. And see, we can see everything's getting jammed right against the edge here. So I'm going to go to my vertical box, and I'm going to put some padding all around it, 20 pixels or so. And in my grid pane, everything's also really tight together. So what we can do is we can put in, say, spacing of 10 pixels between all the elements. And maybe we'll do 20 between all the main elements in a vertical box. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to put in something to hold the volunteer ID, first name, last name. Now the date worked. We want our user to be able to select that date. So I'm going to use something called the date picker. And similarly, hours worked. Here, typically, we should use some kind of an item that has control features in it, like a spinner or something like that. But to get this up and running, I'm just going to use a text box, and then I'll do another video later on, and we can make it something a little more appropriate, like a spinner or something. Let's just put in a text field to get this off the ground quickly. And since this isn't meant to be anything that if you wanted to be able to edit the volunteer ID or first name or last name, then you should use a text field. But for now, I'm just going to put in a label here. Now, one of the neat things you can do is you can actually, well, let's make this bigger, stretch it out a bit so we can see some pixels between some of these bigger objects. We can add in a couple other things here. Let's put in something to hold some buttons. So I'll put in an H box, horizontal box. And then in here, we can put in some buttons. So I'll put in 2 buttons. You can see what's fantastic is the buttons actually inherited our style already. Put some spacing around them. And let's make this bottom right. There we go. Okay, and this button, we can make it log the hours. And this button here, we can say cancel. Now, if we found, and here it looks like our grid's a bit wide, you can actually configure the grid. If you go into layout, you can put, there's a preferred width, but you can also put in a maximum width. So right now it looks like we're 760 pixels. We could bring this down to say 100, something like that. And we could also say that's maximum width is 600. That'll just make it a little bit tighter. And if we want to, we can bring the scroll over just so things look a little bit cleaner. Now the other thing we could do is we could add in a like a little area here for error message in case the person's logging something that's invalid. So let's do that. We'll throw in a label. Right here, and just make it the same width as everything else. Now here's a neat little trick you can do to speed up some of your coding. If you want to just label all of these elements right from the beginning, so here we can say so for example, this is going to be a volunteer ID. So if I want to, I can actually go in here and I can type in an FX ID for it already. So I can say this is the volunteer ID label. And I can say that this is first name label. Last name label. Picker. Hours worked text field. And I could say that this is the error message label. Now, what I like about doing this technique, if I say save, it updates the fxml file to include all these, but I can also just go here to say, show me a sample controller. And what's fantastic is now all of my, I can just copy right from here, go into NetBeans, into the controller class for this log hours view. And inside the class, I paste. And now all of my instance variables are here. And if I do, I think it's Control-Shift-I, it will actually show me, here's all of the imports that it recommends. And I say, okay. And then I'm done, right? I don't have to go back into Scene Builder and reconnect them all. It just saves a little bit of time. Okay, so now we want to initialize all of these items. So I'm just going to pull this up a bit here to save some space. I know it's not necessarily the preferred style, but I like it better this way. And then we need to have an instance variable for a volunteer. Okay, so when we and what did we call ours? Ours is models dot volunteer. Okay. So we need to have the volunteer information, right? We have to load a valid volunteer in order to store the information for a valid volunteer. And we created a scene changer. So if we go back to our scene changer, we have a scene changer that can accept in a volunteer. We can pass a volunteer in given a controller class. So what we're going to have to say with this is that it implements initializable and controller class. And then we can left click, implement all the abstract methods, and that will force us to have this method called preload data, which will pass in a volunteer. And all we need to do with that is we just have to say this dot volunteer is equal to the volunteer that we passed in. And then we can set these different attributes like volunteer ID label, first name label. I'm just going to copy these down here. Set text. Right? And now I can refer to my volunteer and I can get where's the volunteer ID? There we go, which is going to return us a string. So I need to say integer dot toString. Okay. So now my volunteer ID label will be set. It's upset about something. Let's see. Expecting a bracket. I have a bracketing issue. So that doesn't have a closing bracket. There we go. First name label. Set the text. The volunteer, get the first name. Set the text. And we'll say volunteer, the last name. Okay, so now when this view opens up, we have to pass in our volunteer information, and then we're able to set the volunteer ID, first name and last name labels. So our view is going to populate these three items here. Now the date worked. We obviously want to pick something pretty close to the current date. So what we can do is we can assume the current date. So what was the date picker? We called it date picker. That's a good name. Date picker. Set the value to today. Add our imports. And we can assume 8 hours for our hours worked as well. So this text field, set a default value. Or actually, we can say, yeah, 8 hours by default. We could use a spinner for this, but I wanted to just keep this video as short as I could, so I'm just using a text field. Hit save. Okay. So now we've initialized all of the fields, and the user could interact with the fields. Oh, we should also set up this error label. Ooh, that didn't come through. Did I not? I didn't scroll far enough. I'll set it to the empty string for now. I'm not going to make it invisible. I'll just set it to the empty string. So now we need to decide, what do we want to do? Well, let's first connect up the log hours. So So if this is the case, that interaction event here, make sure you get the JavaFX one, not the AWT. Okay, so what do we want to do? Well, we can try. Okay, we have our volunteer object. It already has all the logic built into it to validate the inputs. So what we can do is we can try, and we can say volunteer, and we can say insert into database. Oops, sorry. We want to log hours. And we're going to go to our date picker to get the date object. And then we can go to the hours worked text field. Text. Now that'll give us a string. So right now the error is going to say incompatible types. Strings cannot be converted to ints. So we have to say integer parse int. I'm going to put this over a new line here so it's a little easier to read. Why is this upset now? SQL exceptions. So we need to say catch SQL exception E. Okay, so there we go. And actually, we can catch SQL exception, and we can also catch, there's another type of exception that could be thrown, and it's the illegal argument exception. And if we catch that one, what we're going to do is we're going to say error message label at the text. That'll be E, get message. So whatever message we gave, like, you know, the hours were invalid or the date was too old or what have you, will show as our error message. All right, so we're moving right along here. We've got a view. We've got a save button. We need to connect that up. Click on my save button. And then here, you can say save button pushed. Save that. So now this is connected. All we need now is a way to get to this particular view. So to do that, if we look at when we run our, our application today, if I log in, if I click on a user, if I had a log hours button, I could jump to that scene that we've created now. So let's do that. Let's add a button to this particular view. So we go in here. That particular view was the volunteer table view. So double click. Here we go. Let's add in a button. Log hours. We can make it the same size. These ones are 250. There we go. They all look the same now. Save. And then we're going to have to update the controller for that view. So that's the volunteer table controller. So if we go to the initialize method, see how we disabled that button until we selected a user. So we'll do the same thing here. We'll have to actually give it a name. Go into our view here, go to code. After I save it. Okay, so now this button is connected to our controller. So we disable it to start, and then we had a method if if a particular if a user was selected. So let's find that. Volunteers selected, and we'll enable the button. So we'll say if, whoops. Log hours button, table, be false. Means we can see the button. So now, fingers crossed, we've hopefully got the ability to log hours. So let's give this a test drive. We log in, see our button, but it's just disabled. Let's go to one of our newer users. I click on it, they become enabled. I say log hours, and it didn't change. We haven't created a method to make it change scenes. So let's do that. A new scene changer object. we can say sc dot change scenes, and this time we have to pass in a volunteer. Okay, so the view name is going to be log hours view dot fxml. The title for it is going to be log hours. Now what we have to do is we have to pass in a particular volunteer and an instance of the controller class. Okay, so it's going to be very similar to when we edit the user. So let's go up here to our edit button. So here, this is how we got our volunteer and create an instance of our controller. So let's just take that and bring it down. To here. Okay. So this gets user for the volunteer from the table. Okay. So if that is null, if somehow we went to a row that didn't actually have a volunteer in it, then what we can do is we can just return here else. I really need the else because if you return, you're already back. Now we have a volunteer, and our controller class is going to be called log hours view controller. Okay. And we throw our IO exception because we are loading this file from the file system, so it is quite possible for some reason it will not find it. Okay, let's try running this now. So we log in, select the user, we go to log hours. Aha, one last step I forgot. I have to connect this method now in my view. So in here, I need to connect it up. So I go to log hours. So it's pulled in the volunteer ID, their first name, last name, the current date, the hours worked, and if I say log hours, looks like I have an error in my SQL syntax. Ah, no, so close, but so far. Okay, let's go to our volunteer and see what could be wrong with our SQL. So it says insert into hours worked, volunteer ID, nothing. Oh no, I have an extra space in here, I think. Hours worked and date worked. Okay, so let's close that, launch it again. data truncated for column hours worked at row 1. Well, that's interesting. Truncated 8. Oh, let's go into our database to see what we got. Didn't store anything. All right, that's not good. Let's see why. Let's take a look and try to work it out. So when we first load, let's go to our log hours controller. We preload the data, so that part all worked. That looked fine. And we said the volunteer. Okay, so like our instance variable for the controller here, volunteer, is set right from the beginning. And then we use that object to log the hours. And we use the date picker to get the value. And we use the hours work text field to get a number, which should have worked. What we got was this, data truncated for hours worked. Let's take a look back at our SQL here. Okay. So, should be the day worked and then the hours worked. So that's correct. But here I have it reversed. Great, so I did, here I did the date worked, but I had these two things reversed. Okay, try this one more time and hopefully we've got it just right. There we go, we know our database validation works, log some hours, log some hours. Hey, that looks like it worked okay. Let's go back in to our database. And here we can see work ID 2, volunteer ID number 12, worked 8 hours, today's date. Okay, fantastic, we got it working. And if we put in a number like 123, it says, oh, must be in the proper range, right? So we shouldn't have seen anything in our, no new entries in our database, so that's good. And if we put this in a valid range here, we picked a date that was a little too old. And it says, must be within the last 12 months. And it can't be in the future. Perfect. So it looks like all of our validation works. The last thing we need to do is if we hit cancel, we want to go back to the screen we just came from. So that's easy to do because we've got this great little scene changer. Utility. Oh, I'm in the wrong, like why wouldn't this come up? I'm in the wrong area. this will be our log hours view controller that we want. And here we can just say scene changer, change scenes, and the name of the new scene is going to be all volunteer view.fxml, and the title of it is all volunteers. Okay. Just connect it up in our view. One last little test. Log in. Pick a volunteer. If I hit cancel, ooh, didn't like that. Oh, it's called volunteer table view. Where did I get that? Okay. And it works back. Beauty. All right, there you go. We'll see you in the next video. Cheers.